Hello and welcome to a brand new season of the British Food History Podcast, the 10th season. As ever, I am your host, Dr. Neil Buttery, food historian and chef. On the podcast today is medieval scholar Katherine Harvey, who specialises in medieval and early modern history. And today we're talking about healthy eating in the Middle Ages. Now, I've got lots of news to tell you, but I shall save most of it for the end, except for these two things. First of all, it's not just the British Food History Podcast that's restarted, but also A is for Apple, an encyclopedia of food and drink, the podcast I co-host with fellow food historians Sam Bilton and Alessandra Pino. It's Season C, and in the first episode, I talked about cabinet pudding. Sam took on the topic of carbonado, and Ali went for carrot, a low-hanging fruit, if you know what I mean. Second thing, I'm very excited to announce that I've got a new sponsor in the shape and form of the fantastic Netherton Foundry. Netherton Foundry are producers of top-quality British-made cookery equipment. Nestled in rural South Shropshire, Netherton Foundry, headed by Neil and Sue Curry, take inspiration from the local ironmasters of the 18th and 19th centuries to craft industrial cookware from iron, oak and copper using non-toxic materials. Their cookware is built to last, whether it be their famous prospector pans, of which I am a proud owner, crumpet rings, or their impressive range of outdoor cookware. Netherton Foundry ships to several countries as well outside of the UK, including USA and Canada, so visit netherton-foundry.co.uk to find out more about their wonderful products, approved not just by me, but by folks such as Tom Parker Bowles, Diana Henry and Nigella Lawson. And we're going to be hearing from, well, not just Sue and Neil, but the whole team at Netherton Foundry in a couple of episodes' time, so watch this space. Right, let's get going. Today, I am speaking with Katherine Harvey about healthy eating in the Middle Ages. Katherine's new book, The Medieval Guide to Healthy Living, has just been published. It came out on the 1st of April, so it's hot off the press, published by Reaktion Books. Her previous book, which we also mention, which sounds excellent and is now on my to-read list, was published in 2021, also by Reaktion, and is called The Fires of Lust, Sex in the Middle Ages. We talk about humoral theory and health, the dangers of eating fresh fruit and fish, the importance of sauces, drinking and drunkenness, how obesity was viewed in medieval society, and the importance and very high regard of cleanliness, amongst many other things. Those listening to the Secret Podcast get bonus material where we talk about the importance of mealtimes when thinking about health, and we also talk about the poorer members of society who don't necessarily have much of a choice when it comes to selecting food for healthy eating. And at the end, I'll let you know about the perks of being a subscriber if you're interested in supporting my work. But now, please enjoy Healthy Eating in the Middle Ages with Katherine Harvey. Welcome to the podcast, Katherine, and congratulations on the publication of The Medieval Guide to Healthy Living. I very much enjoyed reading it.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this because although I have not studied the Middle Ages officially, I just find it all so fascinating. It's all so tantalising. It's amazing what we know, but when it comes to food, we don't know a great deal, so you get to use your imagination, I think, a lot more. And I just find it, I love the Middle Ages so much. Before we get started, though, could you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and how the book came to be?
Yes, so I'm a medieval historian, and I've been interested in sort of the history of medicine and the history of the body for quite a long time now. My last book was about sex in the Middle Ages, The Fires of Lust, it was called. And one of the things I looked at in there was sort of sexual health and the role they thought sex played in a healthy lifestyle. And I suppose once I'd finished writing that, I thought, okay, maybe I could write one about healthy living more broadly in the Middle Ages, which is a concept that we don't particularly associate with the Middle Ages. But I hope that the book does convince people that that was a thing back then. And so the book it's quite wide-ranging. It looks at all sorts of aspects of healthy living. Food and drink obviously is a big bit of it, but I also talk about things like exercise, what they thought was a healthy living environment, hygiene, sleep, mental health, and sort of how that was applied through the life cycle. So yeah, it's quite broad-ranging, but food is a really important part of it.
Well, yes, I mean, there's a chapter specifically on food, but one thing that I noticed reading the rest of the book, food is pretty prominent in every single chapter, actually. The connection between food as sustenance, but also as a kind of medicine, and health is so much more closely linked to, I mean, it's always been closely linked, obviously, it still is now, food and health, but it seems to be very, very closely tied in the Middle Ages.
Absolutely. I mean, food and drink are there's these 6 factors called the non-naturals, and they're factors sort of external to your body that are thought to really help to determine whether you stay healthy or whether you get ill. And so, yeah, food is really very prominent there are texts called regimens, which are basically how-to guides about how to stay healthy. And often if you read a medieval regimen, most of that will be taken up with food and talking about different foods in terms of the impact they're going to have on your health. And I think one of the reasons for this is because of medieval understandings of digestion. So they see blood as being sort of the end product of digestion. They think that whereas we now know the blood circulates around the body, thanks to William Harvey, they thought that the liver was constantly producing new blood. And that comes from the food that you digest. And so in a really literal sense, they thought a person was what they ate. And it also links into the humoral theory that was the dominant medieval way of understanding the body. Your health is determined by the balance of these 4 humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. And they are variously hot and cold and wet and dry. And so are foods. Foods are classified in this same way. And so what you eat has a direct impact on the humoral balance of your body. So if you're eating the right stuff, it can help to keep your body in balance. But if you eat the wrong stuff, it can make you ill. And this humoral theory does mean that they have some quite odd ideas about what's healthy and what's not. So, for example, we now tend to think of fruit, eat fruit, it's good for you, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, all that sort of stuff. They were quite worried about fresh fruit, particularly things like apples and pears, because they think they're cold and moist. And so they'll put your body out of balance. They think it's much safer to eat them cooked. Stewed apples they'd be much happier with than a fresh one. And something else they're very worried about is fish, which again, I think we tend to think of now as the healthy option.
Surprised at that, especially because fish is eaten during Lent. So I thought if if any animal's going to be healthy, it's going to be a fish.
Yeah, you'd think it was a good one. To us, it feels quite virtuous to go, for a large portion of the year, I only eat fish. But no, in health terms, it's really quite problematic because it's cold and wet. So it makes you produce lots of phlegm. And so potentially it's going to make you ill. And so they do eat fish, as you say, for religious reasons. And also because people like it. One of the things they eat a lot of is eel and lamprey, which I must admit to me sounds disgusting. I don't fancy that at all. But it was really quite a delicacy then. And they know, people write about the fact they know it's not good for them, but it's tasty, so they want to eat it anyway.
Henry I, of course, infamously died of his surfeit of lampreys, didn't he? He went against medical advice.
Yeah, I can't imagine wanting to eat a surfeit of lampreys, but there you go, tastes change. But I mean, one of the good things, and maybe what he should have done, is that they did think up to a point you could mitigate the risks by the way you cooked stuff. So if you chose a cooking method that helped to warm it up and make it less moist, though often they think it's good to say fry fish rather than boil it, because that will help to make it a bit safer. And they also use a lot of sauces. Sauces are really important in medieval cooking, and one of the reasons for that is because they can balance out some of the problematic properties of, say, the fish you're eating. By putting a sauce on it, that will make it safer to eat, and probably also tastier too. So it's, a benefit all round.
So I've got into trouble in the past, Kathryn, for the way I've talked about humoral theory. I guess it's my sciencey ways, and I've not meant to get into trouble. But we know from a scientific point of view that there aren't just 4 humours, and balancing them, therefore, isn't a thing. So the theoretical framework, if you like, that all of this is based on is incorrect. However, from studying all of this, do you really pick up, get in tune with that medieval logic and see where they're coming from? And are there conclusions? I mean, I know you said, they have cooked fruit rather than raw fruit, but in the main, do you think actually they're making pretty good decisions here because their intuition, just like now, it's all about intuition really, and a lot of it's quite obvious, and the things that hit the headlines are the weird, crazy choices. But do you find actually bear in mind the theory's not actually correct, they're actually doing a pretty good job?
Yeah, I think it's probably not as mad as you might think. I mean, it's a very wrong system, but it's a very coherent system. And so it does all tie together. And yeah, I mean, I think although they have got some odd ideas about things like fruit and fish, I think, broadly speaking, they are talking about eating a balanced diet, eating things in moderation. They worry about things like too much salt in food, which I think is quite interesting. Obviously, they're not thinking about it in terms of blood pressure and the things that we worry about now. But they are worried about the fact that if you, for example, they preserve a lot of their fish by salting it, and they're quite keen that it's important to wash that all off before you cook it and to sort of to try and, not to eat too much salt. So a lot of what they're saying, although they're not saying it for necessarily the right reasons, would have been relatively sensible things to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I think something else that seems odd to us is that they're very interested in sort of diets for the individual. And probably now we tend to think, broadly speaking, the same things are good for all of us. Whereas they're far more interested in things like how your complexion, your individual humoral makeup might shape what you should eat. So if you're somebody who's already very cold, then it's really important that you don't eat a lot of these cold, wet foods. Your location matters. They're very, very hot on this idea that the food of your native place is the healthiest for you. So whereas now we tend to think it's good to be adventurous, they get quite worried about, if you go abroad and you have strange food, they wouldn't be worried about food poisoning and bacteria in the same way that we would, but they would think that strange foreign foods might upset your humoral balance and make you ill. And the other thing, and this feels quite wrong to us, is they think that what you need to eat depends in part on your social status. So if you are a peasant, you've got, a coarse peasant digestion, you spend a lot of time doing physical labour, then you can eat sort of rough, gritty bread. You can eat beef, which is thought of as quite a coarse meat that produces lots of superfluities, but that's all right because you're a peasant, your digestion can cope with them, and all this physical labour you're doing will mean that you sweat all the nasties out.
I see.
Whereas if you're, a nobleman or something, you've got this delicate digestion, delicate complexion. You don't just want expensive food, you need it. And so their conspicuous consumption is very much justified by that. They some of them virtually eat like invalids. So they think, chicken is a good meat for delicate digestions. And so the sick should eat it, but so should the rich. So yeah, that to us feels a bit uncomfortable.
Yes, but in a way, I mean, it means only relatively recently that those ideas have changed, I would say. Now, one thing that was drunk a lot, people did drink fresh water, actually, didn't they? That's a bit of a misconception, but a lot of ale was drunk and wine was drunk, and I think people therefore assume that people were a little bit trashed the whole day. And, maybe if you're drinking 12 pints of ale a day, like some people tilling the fields might have been, then you maybe would have the edge taken off. But how was drunkenness viewed? I'm assuming it wasn't a good thing just to be absolutely pinballing around, even though everybody is drinking alcohol, or most people anyway are drinking alcohol to some degree.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think probably they did drink more alcohol than we would think was a good idea, though, as you say, they did also drink water. Ale's a really important part of the peasant diet. Probably that's where quite a lot of them are getting quite a lot of their calories from. But it's very low alcohol content, most of this ale they're drinking. And they do tend to eat it with a lot of breads and, the sort of starchy foods that would take the edge off up to a point. The healthiest drink they think is wine. Wine, according to medieval doctors, is virtually medicine because it gently warms and moistens the body. They think it aids digestion. It produces very good quality blood. It cheers you up. So it's great stuff. Nevertheless, yeah, they're very keen on the idea that people need to drink in moderation. In fact, they often drink their wine watered down in a way that we wouldn't tend to do now. And yeah, there are lots of reasons why you shouldn't get drunk. And again, some of it is coming from the church. They're very hot on the idea that drunkenness is a sin. and it leads to even worse sins. They're particularly concerned about the idea of drunkenness as a cause of lechery. So, so that, the moral messages are very much, you shouldn't be getting drunk. And from a health point of view, they know that it's bad for you to binge drink, to keep getting drunk. They do talk a bit about alcoholism, which sometimes people think wasn't recognised in the past, but I think they did know, they did understand that it was a problem if you couldn't get by without drink. But inevitably, people do get drunk. And they think this happens because the vapours produced as wine was digested rose to the head, and it sort of clouds your brain and upsets everything. And so there are some great tips on how to avoid a hangover. And most of them, I think, probably would have been about as effective as modern hangover cures. Things like go, eat a sour apple before you go out to get drunk, or wear an amethyst, which will sort of suck up the vapours. There's one story about a woman who claims her father never got drunk because he would always invoke St. Nicholas before and after he went to the pub. I don't think that would work, but I suppose it's worth a try.
If you expect it to work, it works quite often, though, doesn't it?
Yeah. And then, if you've got a hangover, then a lot of it is the same stuff that we would still do, sleep it off. Some people think that exercise will help because it will help to dissipate the vapours. Some people say eat cabbage. I don't know that would make you feel better, but it's supposed to cool the body and stop all the heat moving towards your head. But I don't know. I'd recommend that one.
Well, we talked about drinking water there a moment ago. Another thing that's very comes over very strongly in the book, as well as this link between food and health, is people's view again towards cleanliness, because it's a very lazy misconception, is it, that people of the Middle Ages, they were just living in this sort of squalor and filth, and not only were they living in the squalor and filth, they quite liked it. It was just normal to them. There's that famous scene, isn't there, from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, with those two peasants making big mud pies, which is probably my favourite scene, but historically, it's not the most accurate,
not good,
I don't think. Let's bust some myths. Water's an element. It's one of the 4 elements, so I'm assuming, actually, it was, rather than people drinking lots of filthy water, it was something that was highly prized, and people probably wanted to consume water that was very clear, fresh, bright, and good for them, surely.
Yeah, definitely they did drink water. They drank water far more than we think they did. Obviously, there were problems with dirty water, but we do see in the Middle Ages, sort of in towns particularly, increasingly, the authorities sort of creating the infrastructure to bring in clean water from outside the city, to provide fountains and things so that there is a decent water supply. And they've got quite clear ideas about the idea of, you're better to drink fresh, clear, moving water, that you shouldn't drink stagnant water. They seem quite keen actually on boiling water, which obviously would make it a lot safer. So that definitely, feels like a good thing. There are times when it can be dangerous to drink water. They're quite concerned about drinking water abroad. Again, I don't think they're thinking about it in terms of bacteria, but to the point where some people do suggest, if you're a wealthy pilgrim, go to the Holy Land or something, take loads of barrels of water or wine with you so that you've got something safe to drink while you're travelling. The other thing that seems odd to us that they're quite worried about is the danger of drinking cold water on a hot day.
Yes,
basically, because it's such a shock to the system. That they think it can kill you. Basically, the shock of the cold will stop your heart and it can kill you. I think there was a 16th century French prince who was supposed to have died like that, playing tennis, and then had a cold drink, and that was supposed to have killed him, they thought. So that's something they're quite worried about. But no, water very much is seen as something that it is good to drink, as long as you're drinking nice, fresh, seemingly clean water.
Were there social differences when it comes to social classes about who's drinking water? Was it kind of one of those things where it's like, well, yes, we do drink clean water, but was it considered more of a peasant drink because it's there, freely available, as opposed to wine, which of course is quite a lot of infrastructure to be able to make some wine?
I think definitely there can be a bit of that.
Mm.
But we do have evidence of elite people drinking water. There's a Portuguese king Duarte, who is very interested in medicine, writes quite a lot about medicine, and his own mental health. He's very prone to melancholy. But one of the things he'd noticed that women and Muslims drank less wine and they tended to live longer. And so he'd got this theory that actually drinking water was good for you. And I think it's Petrarch the poet Petrarch, who writes about how, well, sometimes the doctors say, well, maybe you should drink wine instead of water, but he's drunk water since he was a boy and it hasn't done him any harm. So I think definitely there are people out there who are drinking it despite the fact they could afford lots of good wine and like it. So it's definitely more complicated than we think.
Yeah. And I suppose the other thing that people often think about is, there's lots of food waste and human waste just lying around in the streets. And, well, actually, one thing that I thought when I was reading the book, if you look at the news now, there's fly tipping everywhere. Rivers are full of raw sewage from the water companies. We're kidding ourselves. We're saying the people in the Middle Ages are living in a filthy world. And, our world is just as filthy. It's just done in a different way, really, isn't it? I mean, it helped me have more of a connection to the Middle Ages, really, when I was reading the book, I have to say.
Yeah, no, I agree that, we've got this idea that we're really clean and they were really dirty. And I actually think the more you look into it, the more you see they're just like us, really. They're trying to keep their streets clean. And people do make a mess of them. People do dump rubbish. People do urinate in the streets where they're not supposed to and stuff. But as you say, it still happens.
Absolutely, it does.
They are worried about it. They see it as a health risk, largely because it produces miasmas, bad smells that they think can make them ill. And so increasingly, the authorities do things to help keep the streets clean. So they'll employ street cleaners. They'll employ basically dustmen to take the rubbish out the city. They'll have set places where rubbish can be dumped. They make people clean up the areas around their homes. And we get people complaining if people don't. They're particularly worried about butcher's waste.
Yes.
That's particularly likely to make you ill. And so definitely we get cases, there are some particularly in London in the sort of the 14th, 15th century where people will complain, well, the butcher is dumping his waste in the ditch down the back of my house and it's making me and my household ill. And the authorities will take that seriously and take steps against the butcher and try and get this problem sorted out. And they're also quite concerned about sort of food hygiene in markets and making sure that produce is suitable quality, making sure that it's only sold for a certain amount of time, making sure that it's properly cleaned up and disposed of afterwards. And there are people in the Middle Ages who are prosecuted for selling meat that's not fit for human consumption, pies that have made people ill. So, yeah, although maybe it might not have been quite as effective as some of the things we have now, they were worried about it and they did have things that were trying to make food as safe as possible.
Yes, the things that disgust us disgusted them too. And
absolutely.
They tried to rectify it as easily as possible. I mean, when you're living in large towns and cities, I mean, it's always been a battle against, the exponentially increasing populations and dealing with the public health. It's a problem that's never gone away. And I can really see very, very little difference. One of the things that people reckon are different, and I suppose it generally is, of course, we're living in a day where we're eating, a lot of us are eating anyway, ultra-processed foods. Even though, I mean, white bread flour is probably the original UPF, I would say. And a lot of people talk about how there's a lot of obese people today, which there are, and there were never any obese people in the past because people weren't eating to excess. They weren't eating these ultra-processed foods. But is this true? Is this a bit of a misconception? I'm assuming, I mean, gluttony is a deadly sin, right? So I'm assuming there must have been some obese people. How was that viewed in society? Was it considered a good thing because it meant you were able to get hold of a lot of food, or was it the opposite? What was going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have often got this idea that, fat people in the past was seen as lucky and was seen as even maybe more attractive because it proved you were rich, it proved you had lots of food. But I think actually it's not really like that, but partly because, as you say, the whole gluttony thing, that it's a sin to eat too much and to be too interested in your food is very much seen as morally a bad thing. But also from a medical point of view, I mean, they weren't counting calories like we were, and they weren't obsessing over carbs and things. But they did know that eating too much could cause weight gain, and they did recognise that it was a health problem and that it could it could stop your body working properly. Now, some of the things they're fretting about are different to the things that we do. So, for example, one of the things they're worried about is that if you get too fat, it will sort of compress the pores in your skin that you're supposed to sweat through. And that will prevent the excretion of superfluities. So that will be something that will make you ill. I think probably in medical terms, they are concerned about people who are really overweight rather than people who are just a little bit on the heavy side. And so the medical texts seem to be mainly talking about people who've got to the point where their weight is limiting their impact, their ability to do sort of daily activities, limiting their mobility. There's stuff about, people who can't bend down to tie their own shoelaces, things like that. And so the medical texts do have advice for people who want to lose weight. So that they will talk about diet. And often that's focusing on sort of eating foods that are bulky but not nutritious, so the food would move quickly through the digestive system.
I see.
But also exercise. They're quite into bathing as a way to lose weight because they think what you need to do is get rid of the superfluities in your body. And so sweating those out would be a good way to do that.
I see, yeah.
But definitely, I think there's plenty of evidence that obesity was viewed as a problem. There are lots of kings and bishops and sort of important people like that who get criticised by the chroniclers, partly because it's about sin, but also because of this idea that they're too fat to do their job properly. So somebody like Louis VI of France, who apparently got so fat that he couldn't ride a horse. Now, obviously, as a king, if you can't ride a horse, there are all sorts of things, including leading your troops into battle, that you can't do.
Job description.
Yeah. And that definitely is seen as a problem. So that definitely is something they are worried about and sort of opposed to. Evidence that people worried about their own weight is quite thin. It starts to pick up a bit in the 15th century, but before that it is really quite patchy. But one really interesting example, according to Gerald of Wales, the chronicler Gerald of Wales, he claimed that Henry II, King Henry II of England, despite he was quite a moderate eater, the problem wasn't that he was really greedy, but he was still prone to weight gain. And according to Gerald of Wales, he was really quite self-conscious about this. And so he exercised constantly. He was always going riding, he was always going hunting. And then he'd go back to the court at night and he wouldn't sit down, which drove the courtiers mad because, of course, protocol means they can't sit down either.
That's right, yes, of course.
Yeah, so nobody's very happy about that one.
Was exercise linked directly to weight? Did people say one way, obviously adjusting your diet is one thing, but getting plenty of exercise?
I think it's in terms of superfluities, so it's exercise makes you sweat.
I see.
So you're sweating out the superfluities, I think, is how they're working that one.
So it's the same conclusions, isn't it? But again, it's that internal logic isn't necessarily correct.
Yeah.
It's like when you were talking about wine before, like you drink some red wine and it does warm you up. It feels like it warms you up. So you can see how it's considered hot.
There is sense there. They've just reached the wrong conclusion. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect sense. The flip side of obesity, of course, is being underweight. There's pressure today, of course, for women especially, but increasingly for men as well on social media to look a particular way. And of course, for women, it's to look particularly slender. What about the Middle Ages? Were people striving for similar things, or were there similar pressures on people?
I think there is some. We do get odd cases of people who seem to be quite conscious about wanting to look sleek, including that there's one story about a 15th century Italian nobleman who he goes to church, and because he's sort of self-conscious about not wanting to look fat, he doesn't wear he's sort of I think it's some sort of leather thing he's supposed to wear under his clothes to sort of protect him, and then somebody assassinates him in church. And I think that's very much told as a moral story, but there does seem to be sort of, this sense that somebody might be self-conscious of their size behind that. Most of the evidence we've got, though, is about in terms of the church and fasting and people not eating as a religious thing, as a form of asceticism.
I see.
That's mainly, but not exclusively, women. And so you get sort of pious individuals who definitely, they take it too far. Somebody like Katherine of Siena, who was supposed to have lived on water and herbs for years at a stretch. Now, some people admire that. Some people see that as a sign of sanctity. But a lot of people, and actually increasingly a lot of churchmen are uncomfortable with this. They think, actually, you're supposed to look after your body. It's God's creation, therefore you should look after it. They're worried about sort of hypocrisy, basically about people's almost showing off. And they recognise that it affects people's health, that it's not a healthy thing to do. So somebody like Albertus Magnus, who was a 13th century polymath who wrote a lot of medical stuff as well as all sorts of other things, he writes about chaste virgins who fast so much that they become emaciated, they don't menstruate. And he's very much talking about it in the same sort of terms as we would now, as something that, it's not good to take it that far. some people have just talked about that as holy anorexia. I'm not
Yes.
sure it's exactly the same thing as we would now
okay.
call anorexia, but clearly there are commonalities there.
Fashions about body shape and size have changed greatly in my own lifetime, so never mind over the last 1,000 years or whatever. What was considered the attractive figure for a woman in the Middle Ages? I've read in the past that rather than being sort of skinny, it's kind of a sort of slight pot belly.
The pot belly.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, you don't want to be striving for being underweight because you're going to lose your lovely pot belly that everyone says is the right thing to have.
Yeah. No, they definitely weren't into that sort of heroin chic look of the 90s. They definitely wouldn't have been into that. But
No.
yeah,
Courtney Love wouldn't be.
Wouldn't be, no. But I mean, on the other hand, they are sort of concerned about fat women, both as a sign of sort of gluttony and sin, but also that they sort of think that if you're very fat, that might affect your fertility. So a woman who was too fat then might not be seen as a wife material because there'd be question marks over her ability to have children.
I suppose if you're one of the upper classes, a woman in the upper classes, I guess that's your main job is to make babies, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah.
For
So it is going to be something they're going to be worried about. Yeah.
No, indeed. Well, look, it's time to wrap up, Katherine. It's been so fascinating talking to you about this. It's such an interesting book. It's very detailed and well researched, but it's got you've got such a great writing style. So you absolutely just zip along reading through the book. It's really good. I can't say that about all historical books that I have to read. It really helped me, like I said before, connect, I think, to the people of the Middle Ages.
Thank you.
Where and how can people find out more about you and your work?
So the book is out on the 1st of April and should be available from all the usual places. I've got a website. If you Google Katherine Harvey Historian, you should find me on there. I'm on Instagram and all the usual places where I'll be posting about events and things that I'm doing over the next few months. I'm doing the York Festival of Ideas this year, and I've got a few other things coming up. So I'll be putting those on the website and on social media as they come in.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much again for sparing the time to come on. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katherine. There are lots of links in the show notes, including the Medieval Guide to Healthy Living, her website and social media, as well as a few of the other things mentioned in today's chat, like the York Festival of Ideas, where Katherine will be appearing, that scene from Monty Python, The Holy Grail that we talk about, just in case, on the off chance that you've never seen it. There are links too to pertinent past episodes of the podcast with medieval themes, such as Medieval Meals and Manners with Danielle Cebulski, Subversive Feasting in Medieval King and Commoner Tales with Mark Truesdale, Form of Curie with Christopher Monk, and the episode where I talk about medieval eels with John Wyatt Greenlee. There are also links to blog posts with medieval recipes and essays, such as one on medieval dining, medieval blancmange, and another with my recipe, or interpretation anyway, for frumenty. Right, other news. New things on the blogs. I posted my recipe for toad in a hole. There's some history in there too, of course, which, by the way, I made in my Netherton Foundry prospector pan, which is a complete coincidence because I did that well before I'd even contacted them about them maybe becoming a sponsor. Also, if you go to Neil Cooks Grigson, the blog that started everything off, I wrote a review of the lamb and mutton recipes in Jane Grigson's English Food. I've still got 3 recipes to cook from English Food. I'm hoping to tick one of those off later on in the year, but we'll see. It's getting very tricky now. What else? Oh, I was on TV. BBC Breakfast, in fact, talking about the recent Birmingham bid to get the Balti recognised by UNESCO as a food with a distinct and important heritage, which it definitely does. In the piece, which is only maybe 5 or 6 minutes long, we end up talking about regional food and the importance of regional food in general. There's a link in the show notes because I put a clip on my YouTube channel, so you can have a look at that if you fancy. Also recently uploaded to the YouTube channel is my 7-part series about the food and food ways associated with Lent and Easter, aka season 1 of the podcast. So you can find that now on YouTube or at the very bottom of your podcast feed. As this episode is going out, it's technically just still Lent, so why not binge the entire season before Easter begins? Okay, it's almost time to go. Please leave positive reviews and rate the podcast on your favourite podcast app so that it can be discovered by more and more people. If you can support the podcast and blog financially, I would be ever so grateful if you go to the blog/website. You can donate a one-off virtual coffee or pint or start up a monthly £3 subscription. That's about $4.50 to get access to the secret podcast, plus bonus blog posts, a monthly newsletter, and more. Everything I receive goes into making more episodes of the podcast and more posts on the blogs. Go to britishfoodhistory.com and click the Support the Blog and Podcast tab, where you can find out about all of the benefits of becoming a subscriber. I will be adding the Easter eggs from previous seasons to the secret podcast, and I was hoping to get season 7's done, but I've ended up, kind of out of the blue, suddenly being very busy with a couple of projects. One being a new book about fermentation, and another that I'm going to have to dangle in front of you, but just say it's got to remain secret for now, but it's very exciting, and as soon as I can tell you about it, I will. What you mustn't forget is that I want your material for the upcoming post-bag edition of the podcast, so please drop me an email, neil@britishfoodhistory.com, or find me on social media. All the links are in the show notes if you don't follow me yet on social media. I've whittled on long enough. I'm going to toddle off. The mixing and sound engineering was done by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. Please do check out his capacious back catalogue. But off I go until next time. Cheerio!